A young woman disappeared from Washington, D.C. in 1999. 25 years later, her case remains unsolved. This is the Joyce Chiang story.
No way. I thought you were going to say Chandra Levy.
You know what? I thought you were going to think that. And we will talk about that case, though. But nope, we're not talking about Chandra Levy's case today. But I bet a lot of our listeners know that one.
Yeah, of course. And I bet a lot of them don't know this one, or maybe they do, but this was a new name for me. So, okay.
Yep. Yeah, and that will be part of our discussion as to why we know one name and not the other.
Yes. Okay, got it.
So actually, I came across Joyce's story while I was researching a different case, and I was drawn to it for a few reasons. So for one, as I mentioned in the intro, it's still unsolved, but I also love discussing crime in the media and the ethics surrounding. So that's why this episode is going to provide a great jumping off point for our discussion today.
Oh, that's good. Okay, I'm really interested. You've hooked me.
All right, but before we get to that, let's go ahead and meet Joyce. Joyce was born on December 7th, 1970 in Chicago, Illinois. Her younger years were spent in Chicago, and then later on the family relocated to Southern California. She was one of 4 children and the only daughter of Taiwanese immigrants. Of her 3 brothers, 2 went on to have very prestigious jobs. Her brother John was the controller of the state of California in 2007 and treasurer of California in 2015.
That's a big job.
It is. And her other brother, Roger, worked for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and then later he would become an executive at the television show America's Most Wanted.
Oh, get out. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And then I also started digging a little more on him, and he's also the creator of the television series The Hunt, which is on CNN.
I don't know The Hunt. Okay, I'll have to check it out.
Okay, so let's get back to Joyce, though. So Joyce attended Smith College in Massachusetts, and she was the student government president in 1992. She then went on to graduate from the evening division of Georgetown University Law School in 1995. While she was in law school, she was also working for Congressman Howard Berman as an immigration advisor. After she finished her law degree, Joyce moved in with her brother Roger, who lived in Dupont Circle. Do you know the Dupont Circle area of D.C.?
Of course, yeah, okay. Definitely.
Yes. And she got a job as a lawyer with the General Counsel's Office of Immigration and Naturalization Service, also known as INS. Side note, INS no longer exists. In March of 2003, its functions were transferred to different agencies under the Department of Homeland Security. January 9th, 1999 was a normal Saturday for 28-year-old Joyce. She went to a movie and had dinner with a few friends before she and one of these friends stopped at a Starbucks for her to get some tea on her way home. Reports say that she wasn't feeling well. She was kind of battling a cold. Her friend offered to give her a ride back to her apartment, but Joyce said she would walk. It was only about 4 blocks home from the coffee shop.
What time was this?
This is around 8 o'clock or so. At 8:15 p.m. is when she actually said goodbye to her friend.
Okay.
And at this point, many believe she left the Starbucks.
Okay.
Now, there's no surveillance available. One eyewitness would say that she left the Starbucks, but another eyewitness would say that she stayed for an additional hour sitting and chatting with an unidentified blonde-haired woman.
Okay.
Unfortunately, this would be the last time that anyone would see her alive. She never made it back to the apartment that she shared with her brother. And unfortunately, nobody would report Joyce missing for 3 days.
3 days? But she shared an apartment with her brother.
So she did, and I don't think we can fault Roger here because she's an adult. She was 28 years old, and Roger said he wasn't too concerned when she didn't come home on the night of January 9th. You know, it was a Saturday night, and he thought maybe she was staying with some friends. Also, remember, this is a time before smartphones and constant communication, so Roger just figured he would see her on Sunday.
Yeah, but what happened Sunday and Monday? I'm not faulting him, certainly. I'm just curious why, if they lived together. Unless they had radically opposite schedules, and she had, stayed with friends regularly, so I guess there could be things.
So he did start to get a little worried on Sunday when he didn't hear from her, but then things got very concerning when one of her friends called Roger to let him know that she didn't show up for work on Monday.
Okay.
And she also hadn't answered her phone or any emails. And everybody who knew Joyce agreed that she would never skip out on her job. So this was a huge red flag for everyone.
So it was 2 nights she was gone before reported missing, like 2 nights, 3 days?
Correct.
That's not really, I understand. Okay.
Yes. So Roger did get worried and he called the police. Again, some people fault him for not calling sooner, but I don't fault him. She was, like we said, she's a grown woman. She could kind of come and go as she pleased. Now, because Joyce was a federal employee, the FBI immediately became involved in her case.
Right.
They tried to pull surveillance footage from the area. They interviewed tons of eyewitnesses and even spoke to an ex-boyfriend, but they had absolutely no leads. The only potential clue was a pager that Joyce had left at the apartment. Now, for those of you who don't know, people in the late 90s carried a small device that's called a pager, and it would pretty much send short messages. Now, it couldn't call anyone back, but it would log the phone number of the person who was trying to reach you. So then you could call them when you got to a landline. Do you remember like 14325?
Of course, yeah.
Okay.
I actually didn't have a pager, but all my friends did.
Really?
Yeah.
Any chance? So you probably don't know this. Some of our listeners might, but 143 was I love you.
Yeah.
25 was I'm sorry.
Yep.
Do you know what 80085 was?
No.
Okay. We can have a quick giggle before we get into the seriousness of this case.
Whoa.
Those numbers, when they're block numbers, it spells out the word boobs.
Okay. Yeah, I probably could have figured that out, but gotcha. All right.
So stupid. Okay.
Yeah.
So the reason why this pager was important is because it had one log number on it, and police were able to track it back to a payphone at a hotel that was near the international airport. But unfortunately, they couldn't narrow it down to anything more than that, so this ended up being a dead end as well.
Yeah, without surveillance, that would make it really tricky.
As the FBI and the D.C. police struggled to make headway in Joyce's disappearance, local media picked up the story. Now, as we alluded to before, it was the local media. This didn't become a national story the way Chandra's story became. So because the local news did pick up her story, a local couple saw the coverage and they came forward with the first break in this case. Around the time of Joyce's disappearance, this couple had been walking through Anacostia Park, which is a large national recreation area, which is close to DC's Anacostia River. Mm-hmm. Now, during their walk, they came across a small wallet, and in this wallet was Joyce's government credit card. Oh. At this time, they turned her card into the park police, and it would remain in the lost and found for 4 days. And again, I don't fault anyone because they probably just thought somebody dropped their wallet.
Oh, yeah,
However, once the couple saw Joyce's picture in a news broadcast, they immediately contacted the FBI to let them know about the wallet and the card.
Did Joyce have to walk through that park to get home?
Nope. And it was about 5 miles from her home.
Oh, okay. Wow. All right.
Now, because of this information, because of this wallet, this set a search team in motion, and more than 60 search and rescue members scoured the area where the card was found. And by this point, Meghan, 12 days had passed since Joyce's disappearance, with no sign of Joyce.
That's a very long time in this kind of investigation.
Now, unfortunately, they did not find Joyce, but they recovered several of her personal items on the banks of the river. Mm-hmm. These items included her apartment keys, her video rental card, also known as a Blockbuster card. Again, for our young viewers and listeners, that's when you used to have to go rent an actual movie, what is it called? A cassette? No, a VCR tape?
It was a tape first and then a DVD.
Yeah, so they found her Blockbuster card, her apartment keys, and they also found her jacket. And this was the jacket she was last seen wearing. And this jacket had a large tear in it. Mm-hmm. So it was very clear to everyone that Joyce had been at that park the night she vanished. Mm-hmm. But as I mentioned, this really made no sense because the park was 5 miles from Dupont Circle, which is the Starbucks that she was last seen at. And for her to get to the park, she would have had to walk for about 2 hours on a cold January night.
Unless she took a taxi.
Well, even if she took a taxi, it was still out of the way. Mm-hmm. And it had not been something that she discussed with her friend when she left the coffee shop. She said she was headed home. Now, does that mean she didn't have plans to meet with someone? Of course not. But despite how she may have gotten there, the fact that her belongings were located by the river's edge meant that there was a high probability that she was possibly in the water.
Right.
So a search of the river was done, but nothing was found at this time.
Right.
Now, weeks would go by without additional information on Joyce's whereabouts. And around a month after her disappearance, the FBI publicly stated that they determined that she had not left the Dupont area of her own free will.
Sure.
They believed that she had been taken by a stranger or even by someone she knew, but that she had not willingly gone to that park.
Mm-hmm.
In addition, they had discovered 2 unknown hairs that were found on her belongings.
Oh.
But despite this evidence, there would be no more movement on the case until about 3 months later when there was a shocking discovery. A man who was canoeing on the river found a badly decomposed body that had washed ashore about 8 miles downstream from where Joyce's personal items had been discovered. Sadly for the Chiang family, DNA tests confirmed that the body was in fact that of Joyce Chiang.
Oh, I didn't see. I thought she was going to be missing. I didn't realize they found her. Okay.
Yeah. Roger was the first to receive the news. Again, Roger was the brother that she lived with. In an interview, he said, quote, "That's when all hope just dashed that Joyce was alive. And I quickly called my mother, one of the most difficult phone calls I've ever had to make, to tell my mother that her daughter was dead. And that's a moment that I will never forget." The condition of her body made it impossible for them to determine how she died, though. And as a result, her cause of death was listed as undetermined. So without evidence of foul play, investigators felt that there was really nothing left to be done. And despite being unresolved in most people's eyes, the case was considered closed.
Closed? I mean,
Closed.
I don't think it's closed, but...
Well, it's even a little worse than closed because as we have seen in countless other cases, police made a public suggestion that Joyce might have died by suicide.
No, they didn't.
They sure did, and her loved ones disagreed. In fact, one of her close friends publicly remarked, quote, "This is a woman without a history of depression. This is a woman who worked very hard in life and had everything to live for. And to lose who she is by saying that she was someone who committed suicide, I think is another injustice to her."
I couldn't agree more, and I wonder if they would ever have said such a thing if this was a man.
Probably not.
Mm-hmm.
No. But only 2 years later, Joyce's case would see renewed interest as similar tragedy rocked Dupont Circle again. In May of 2001, the disappearance of congressional intern Chandra Levy, and I want to pause here and say this case has been suggested many, many times, but as I said, we covered Joyce's instead because she hasn't received as much attention.
Mm-hmm.
But Chandra's case drew renewed media interest to Joyce. Now, there were many similarities between the two, so much so that people would say it was chilling.
What are they?
Now, both of these women were from California. They both worked as congressional interns.
Mm-hmm.
Chandra actually interned at the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I didn't know that. I came across that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. They both lived in Dupont Circle. They went missing just blocks from each other. Some people say they even looked alike. While Joyce was Asian and Chandra was white, they still were both 5'3". They were both weighed about 100 pounds. They both had brown eyes and shoulder-length dark hair.
Interesting.
So this could be a coincidence, but I don't think we could ignore the similarities.
Okay.
One big difference between the two cases, however, was the media coverage. While only a few local news outlets covered Joyce's case, Chandra's disappearance exploded across the headlines of every major news outlet in America. And this was a huge, huge story. Now, many people say it's because she was a middle-class, attractive white woman, which might be true, but I think it had more to do with her personal life.
I think so, too.
So I'm assuming you remember that the media attention was not focused on the fact that she was missing as much so as it was focused on what?
She was having a relationship with a congressman, and
Yes.
I believe that was really the impetus, I think, behind the media's storm.
I would agree with that. She was the mistress of Congressman Gary Condit. He was married. He was about 30 years her senior. He was a Democrat, then serving his 5th term representing California's 18th congressional district. He was also a senior member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. So he's a high-powered guy in D.C.
Yes, he was.
So I think it's safe to say that this fact made the story more sensational.
I think absolutely. Because also fingers were pointed at him pretty
sure
quickly
were.
as well.
They were. And actually, I'm going to give you a Cliff Notes version of Chandra's case.
Mm-hmm.
So Chandra was last seen on May 1st of 2001, but the Metro Police weren't alerted until 5 days later. So just like in Joyce's case, they lost a lot of time.
Right.
And from what I understand in Chandra's case, it was because her parents alerted the police 5 days later because they hadn't heard from her. Once the police were contacted, they called hospitals and they also went to visit her apartment, and they included there was no indication of foul play. Mm-hmm. But once they were alerted to her affair with the congressman, they stepped up this investigation.
Right.
And this is when they got a search warrant to, search more of her apartment. They found her credit cards. They found her identification. They found her cell phone. They found her purse. They also found partially packed suitcases. So this was leading them to think that maybe she was planning on going somewhere. Her answering machine, another flashback to olden days, an answering machine when you had a landline. People would leave you messages and you could not check them until you got home. Actually, I think you could call your answering machine and check them.
I loved checking my machine when I got home. I used to get excited with the flashing light.
It's so fun, right? And how many beeps was how many blinks was how many messages you had.
Uh-huh.
So her answering machine had many messages from her relatives and 2 from Gary. And Gary was scrutinized. They determined that he was not a person of interest, though, in this case.
I think it pretty much ruined his career, though, as well.
It did, but from what I understand, his wife stayed with him, and They moved and opened up, I think, a Baskin and Robbins somewhere. So.
I guess I just mean, the label, we know the stigma of being associated with it, a crime like this or being a suspect, it follows you.
I mean, not only being a suspect, but having your reputation tarnished because you're having an affair and you're married and it's an intern and, there's all those other pieces.
That's fine for people to scrutinize that, but we should separate that certainly for being a suspect in a murder case.
I would agree with that, yes. But we have to understand why they looked at him because he had motive. If you looked at her, the victimology here. It wouldn't be until about a year later, on May 22nd of 2002, that Chandra's family would finally have some answers. Skeletal remains, which matched Chandra's dental records, were discovered by a man who was walking his dog in Rock Creek Park. After a preliminary autopsy was performed, District of Columbia Police announced that there was insufficient evidence at that time to open up a homicide investigation. However, they did note that they were suspicious of foul play. A jailhouse informant would lead them to their suspect, and this would be nearly 7 years after the remains of Chandra were discovered. Police charged 20-year-old Ingmar Gwandiki with her murder, and he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Now, this is a very interesting case, and it might be one that we cover, because he admitted to assaulting 2 other women in the same park. However, he adamantly denied ever seeing Chandra, and to this day, he claims he's innocent of this crime. And in 2016, there were new developments that caused the case against him to be dropped.
Oh, wow. I didn't even know about this part.
So there were many legal issues. And as I said, there was also a lot of people talking about the fact that he was in fact innocent, but there were many legal issues that led to the prosecutors to not retry his case and just deport him to his home country of El Salvador. Meanwhile, Chandra's case was now classified as unsolved. And you might not have known this because I didn't either, but Chandra and Joyce weren't the only women from Dupont Circle to be murdered.
No.
Just 5 months before Joyce's disappearance, another woman suffered a similar fate. 28-year-old Christine Mirzian was raped and murdered while walking home from a barbecue in the Dupont Circle area. I have to point out, she was also a congressional intern with dark hair and had similar height and weight to Chandra and Joyce.
Well, so I understand the similarities, but we're also talking about Dupont Circle. So a lot of the young women and men there, it's not surprising that they would be interning in the area.
Of course.
So just to point that out.
Yes, I think that's fair to point out. Now, unlike Joyce and Chandra, Christine's killer was arrested in November of 2019. Giles Daniel Warwick was arrested in connection with the murder of Christine, as well as the assault of many other women.
So is it possible he's connected to Chandra or to Joyce's case?
He was ruled out as suspect as far as I know.
All right.
While Joyce's family had no closure, and again, police had publicly speculated that she had probably died by suicide, the family did finally get some justice. In May of 2011, more than 10 years after Joyce's disappearance, police announced that they were reclassifying her death as a homicide.
Oh, what led to this?
Metro Police Chief Kathleen Lanier explained that, quote, over the past several years, there have been statements made that were inaccurate. So they left it pretty vague, but they had enough reason to believe that statements they had received from suspects somewhere along the investigation, they were able to find, I guess, inconsistencies.
All right.
This is the part that gets frustrating, though. Investigators had identified 2 potential suspects in Joyce's murder. One was serving a life sentence in a prison in Maryland, and another had been deported to Guyana. Problem being, prosecutors simply did not have enough evidence to try this case. We've seen this before, where there seems to be a strong connection between suspects and a crime, but we can't just try people without enough probable cause to take the case to trial. So they were never able to make it to that point.
There's 2 suspects as well, so which one? You wouldn't know possibly if they were related, if they were together, if they're independent, so you'd have to narrow it down, and it's hard to do that with someone who's been deported.
Yep. Unfortunately, it seemed like once again there would be no closure for the Chiang family.
Oh.
And unfortunately, to date, it has remained that way. Joyce Chiang and Chandra Levy have never had their killers brought to justice. To cope with her murder, her brother Roger Chiang self-published a book about his experiences around his sister's death, and it's called My Peace I Offer You. Not only did Roger write this book, he also switched careers. Now, we can speculate about whether or not this career shift had to do with his sister's murder, but he began working as the executive director of America's Most Wanted.
Oh, well, I would imagine that this crime certainly did push him towards that. And what a career change. Wow.
Yeah, this was around, I believe, 2007 or so. And he started out at a lower level and worked his way through the ranks.
Wow. Okay, that's really cool.
And speaking of America's Most Wanted, John Walsh is one of the most outspoken advocates of the theory that Joyce, Chandra, and Christina were all victims of a serial killer in the area.
I mean, that doesn't seem far-fetched to me.
No, but like you pointed out, the similarities between these women, could just be due to the fact of the demographic of the area, besides the fact that they were interns just otherwise brown hair, that's not so uncommon.
It's not so uncommon, but if they are able to eliminate any suspects, if they don't have people in their personal lives, if they're stranger abductions, even if the connection between them or interns is just coincidence, it's not completely outside of the scope to think that it could be a serial offender.
Well, I'll tell you, it's been over 25 years since Joyce's death, and we still don't know anything definitive. And while her case is officially closed, has justice been done here?
Well, no.
I don't even think that's really a question. I think it's clear that justice has not been done. I mean, I think it's clear that she was definitely murdered. I don't think the suicide theory holds any weight. I just struggle with trying to understand if this was a targeted attack or if it was random. Could this be something where she saw something she shouldn't have? She walked into something. Was it a robbery gone wrong? Or,
that's not what I would think, but okay.
On the other end, did she willingly meet someone that evening whom she trusted that maybe harmed her after some sort of argument or disagreement? What do you think?
Or did she meet someone who targeted her because she was on her own and she was lured into a vehicle, abducted, taken to her place, assaulted, and murdered?
Yeah. I think it's clear that she did not go to the park on her own terms.
Yeah.
No one can really see any reason why. It was later at night. It was cold out. She said she wasn't feeling well that evening. It just didn't make sense. It's not that if she was someone who that was part of her normal routine, that she would take evening walks at the park, but that's not what we see here.
You said that there was an eyewitness who said she saw her having coffee with a blonde woman, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so like in my head, I'm thinking she was the lure. Okay, that eyewitness might not have been the case, but there could be a lure. Someone could have slipped something in her drink, walked her out, walked her right into a car, and taken her right away.
So I was thinking that also, but that would seem more for the purposes of sex trafficking if they would use a female to lure her, right? Why?
Yes.
But you're right. If she was being targeted for whatever, or maybe she was being targeted for sex trafficking and then, she put up too much of a fight and who knows?
Yeah, no. I mean, yes, I understand. Yes, that's usually for trafficking, but it was just a theory that came to mind when you said there was someone there with her.
Yes. And whether or not these crimes are related, we just can't be sure.
Right.
But as you mentioned before, this could potentially be the work of a serial offender.
And also, just so you know, with a female, there are, as we have covered, serial team offenders that are males and females, and they're usually for sexual purposes, but the females are usually used in that type of more subservient role to serve kind of the males. So I still see that as a possibility.
And as I mentioned, in both Chandra and Joyce's case, the bodies were too badly decomposed to find any evidence of sexual assault.
That's too bad.
I'm hoping that we do have some answers in these cases, and I wouldn't be surprised if we found out that at least Chandra and Joyce's case were related in some way.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the third victim, was it Christine or Christina?
Yeah, so I didn't do a deep dive into that case because there's not a lot of information available.
Okay.
But from what I found, it seems like they got their guy in that case and that they were not able to connect him.
Okay.
So that case is considered a closed case.
Understood.
And somebody is serving time for that murder. So when we talk about the three cases, it seems like maybe we don't have the same offender for all three.
Right.
Of course, it's possible.
Yeah.
It's possible he's wrongfully convicted. It's also possible he was the offender in the other cases. But I would imagine they did their due diligence and they were able to say he's not part of that.
Okay.
So Joyce's legacy does live on. The Joyce Chiang Memorial Scholarship was established with the help of her family. And what this does is support one student each year with an internship at the Asian American Justice Center, also known as AAJC in Washington, D.C. In addition, the Joyce Chiang Memorial Award was established at Georgetown University Law Center by her friends and colleagues. And I hope that one day her loved ones will be able to have answers. And most importantly, that those responsible for her murder and Chandra Levy's murder will be brought to justice.
Absolutely. Wow, what a frustrating case. You know, I don't fault law enforcement for not being able to find her sooner. And certainly if her body was in a decomposed state, they can't determine the cause of death or sexual assaults, get DNA. All of that is fine. But the insinuation, I think, that she might have taken her own life is probably it's such a punch to the family. And I was very glad to hear that theory was at least repealed and replaced with the likelihood that she was, in fact, a victim of homicide, which is almost certain. Yes. I think that was probably the hardest part for her family to take outside of her actual murder was the insinuation that their loved one would do something like that. So I'm very glad to hear that part was rectified.
Yes, and I can't help but think about Ellen Greenberg's case, Lavina Johnson's case.
Right.
There's so many cases where women were clearly the victims of a violent crime, and their families were told that they died by suicide.
Right. Okay. Glad at least to see that they did fix that. And yeah, I mean, even though it's an unsolved case and cases are incredibly hard to solve after this period of time, we've most definitely seen that happen. So my thoughts are with the families as well, and I hope they can get some answers.
The only other thing that I want to point out is this case also illustrates the importance of taking missing person cases seriously. And again, I don't fault the police. They weren't told. And I don't fault the families because these were both grown women who are allowed to do what they want. They don't need to check in with their family. But I always say better safe than sorry. Yeah. Sometimes people are scared to panic and they don't want to create, I'd rather create a panic than not. Yeah. I actually panic too much because if you don't pick up your phone after if I don't hear from you for a half hour, I assume something's wrong. So we need to find a middle ground because we don't want to waste resources. But
I was going to point that out about you, Amy, but yes, good point. Fair point. Thank you, Amy, and thanks for the case.
Yes. Well, thank you all for listening. And before we head out today, we do have a question from a listener. Oh. And this is an email from Bobby.
Okay.
I love this question. Have you ever had any personal experiences with crime or violence that have influenced your interest in true crime?
Very interesting. Wow. That is a new one. We haven't been asked that one, I don't think.
And there are a lot of podcasts that people who were victims, create a podcast to, it just makes them more interested in being an advocate or telling their story or just providing a platform for other victims. If you don't mind, I'll go first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so my interest, I'm very lucky to say that my interest in true crime did not come from any sort of victimization. While a true crime podcaster, my house did get broken into, which is just ironic. I think we talked about that on here before. But luckily, nobody was hurt. The kids weren't home and, everything ended up being fine. But yeah, so for me, it's pretty straightforward. What about you, Meghan?
I'd like to point out you are very blasé about your house got broken into. You and your husband actually found someone in your home, and that's a lot scarier even so than realizing that someone was in your home, like having to face them.
Fine. And if we're going to talk about it, then yes, he was in my daughter's bed,
yes.
Not just in my home.
Yes.
My daughter, how old was she at the time? She was probably 5 or 6.
She was younger, and that was really scary, I thought.
Yeah, that was scary, and we moved. So
yeah.
So
no, my interest in podcasting or in the field of crime and criminal justice was not due to any experience, however, separately. And I've spoken about this, I think, on another podcast that we did as a guest. But I was stalked by someone I briefly dated many, many years ago. But the stalking turned out to be pretty prolonged and got to be pretty serious, enough so that we went, he was indicted and there were other victims as well. And we went to court and he did serve time for it. So yes, I guess I don't identify as a victim though. I just don't, I feel that way, I guess, about myself or my experience. But I certainly, for all intents and purposes, was a victim of stalking. But it's not related to my interest in the field. I was in the field before that happened.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. And thank you for that question. I really love that we could be doing this for over 5 years and we still get these questions that are so unique.
Totally
so thank you very much.
Yeah, yes. Thank you.
And if you have a question for us, as always, please feel free to message us at womenandcrimepodcast.com/contact. And as a reminder, if you are a patron at the Lifer tier, your question is guaranteed to be read on air.
Yeah, Amy, it's great that you mentioned that. Just a tip, though, for our listeners, Apple is now charging an additional percentage to become a patron. So if you're interested, I would suggest going directly to our Patreon and signing up there.
Thank you for pointing that out. That will definitely save people some money.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you all again for listening, and we hope to catch you next time on Women and Crime.
Women in Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonzo. And music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime.
Sources for today's episode include the Los Angeles Times, Washington City Paper, NBC4 Washington, The Washington Post, WTTG Fox 5, and unsolved.com.